Hello, everyone. My name is Kelly Young. I am a legal counsel with the Justice Collaborative. Welcome back to the latest installment of our Blueprint series. The Justice Collaborative's Blueprint for a Safer and More Just America is a comprehensive framework for national criminal justice reform and outlines concrete steps to address the country's mass incarceration issue and provides actionable solutions to creating a fairer and more equitable justice system. The first two principles laid out in the blueprint are stop making poverty a crime and treat kids like kids. Today, our panelists will discuss how the two intersect with a discussion about youth homelessness and the juvenile justice system, and then what's being done about it. As last month's panelist, Brittany White, said, the part that I always invite people to think about is how we have created a society that leaves people vulnerable to incarceration in the first place. We must take into account the ways we have failed children as a society. Our hope is that this webinar is just one of many conversations about this. And so before I introduce the panelists, I always want to thank the justice volunteers for the great work that you do. And in addition to research and media amplification and on-the-ground actions, during this month of October, Youth Justice Action Month, many of you have signed on to be ambassadors to not only raise awareness about injustices youth face in the criminal legal system, but also to take the necessary steps towards ending them. So thank you very much for that. And towards the end of this webinar, you'll hear from Molly Bernstein, our Associate Director for Volunteer Research and Advocacy, about how you can be more involved in our teams and work to bring about youth justice. And now for our panelists. Joining us, we have Naomi Smoot, Executive Director of the Coalition for Juvenile Justice, Judge Stephen C. Teske, Chief Judge of Clayton County Juvenile Court in Georgia, Aaron Toleafoa, Member and Chair of the Coalition for Juvenile Justice's National Emerging Leaders Committee and Washington State Partnership Council on Juvenile Justice Subcommittee, and Dr. Rachel M. Schimtz, Assistant Professor of Psychology at Oklahoma State University. Thank you all for being with us. And as I start the discussion, if you all have questions, please feel free to write them in the comment box along with your name and where you're from, and we will do our best to get to as many of them as possible. I also encourage you to tweet during the webinar to share what your reactions are and what you're learning, and there'll be a post in the comment section with more info. And so to get us started, Naomi is really going to frame the issue and let us know why we should be talking about this and what the link is between homelessness and juvenile justice.
Sure, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Naomi Smoot. I'm Executive Director of the Coalition for Juvenile Justice. Thank you for being with us this afternoon and for this conversation. We at CJJ really started focusing more on the intersections between youth homelessness and juvenile justice about 3 years ago. The work started as a result of our work around status offenses, things that are illegal only because you haven't yet reached the age of 18, like running away from home, skipping school, those sort of behaviors. What we saw was there's a huge overlap between the populations that are coming to court for those sort of status offense behaviors and the folks who are experiencing homelessness. When we talk about homelessness, just to frame the issue a bit before we get started, we're talking about young people who are alone and without a home, right? They might be unstable housing, couch surfing, living in a car, doubling up with other family members, but they don't have a place to call their own, and they're not sort of the more traditional folks who we think of when we think of youth and homelessness, who might have family members who are living alongside them. These are young people who are experiencing homelessness by themselves. And the numbers are hard to get accurate counts on this because a lot of folks might not want to identify as homeless. They might not see themselves as fitting into that definition. But Chapin Hall has done some really great research on this issue and given us some solid numbers to work with. And their research found that about 1 in 10 young people between the ages of 18 and 24 experience homelessness in a given year. When we're looking at folks under 18, that number is around 1 in 30. So it's around 700,000 kids under the age of 18 who are without a home and without a family to help them get through life. It's about 3.5 million when you're looking at that 18 to 25-year-old age bracket. Not all of those folks obviously are going to also experience homelessness, but there is a large overlap between the number of youth who experience homelessness and the 800,000 kids a year on average who come into contact with the juvenile justice system. There was a study done, 11 cities across the country. Young people were asked to self-identify, do they consider themselves experiencing homelessness or not, and have they had justice system involvement. And what that study found was that about 44% of those young people had spent time in a jail or detention facility. 78% had had some contact of some sort with law enforcement, right? Obviously, if you don't have a place to go home and there's a curfew in your city, for example, and 11 o'clock at night, law enforcement comes through, you're going to be more vulnerable to contact with law enforcement. And then about 62% of young people who took part in that survey had been arrested at some point. Again, there isn't clear data yet on whether the vulnerability point is before contact with the justice system or whether it's after exiting the justice system. Obviously, that looks different for each young person, just like life is different for each young person. Some folks, like I said earlier, have run away from home and thus are experiencing homelessness because of instability in the house. For other folks, they may be returning from a justice placement and there may be restrictions on their living arrangement. So mom, dad, grandma might find themselves in this horrible catch-22 situation, right? Do I let Johnny come home and potentially risk losing housing for my whole family, or do I, not let him come home and then he has to find a way on his own? So there is obviously a large overlap, and I think it's helpful for judges, for lawyers, for volunteers, policymakers to keep that in mind as we're working on these cases.
Thank you for sharing that, Naomi. And then, as we've done in our past webinars, we really want to ground the conversation in what kind of language we should be using, the role that narrative plays in any kind of criminal justice reform. So Rachel's going to talk about, how that plays in with this context.
Thank you, Kelly. And yes, I'm Dr. Rachel Schimtz, and as a sociologist, I've been working with young people experiencing homelessness for several years now. And really my focus has more so turned to thinking about just the importance of young people's perspectives and really the language that we use to frame these more stigmatizing experiences and dynamics of people's lives. And so what we've seen then is this shift towards a really strongly focused person-first language where more so centering the humanizing the person themselves as an individual. So thinking about framing it as people, young people, youth experiencing homelessness rather than putting that identity of homelessness as their master status because it's very stigmatizing in and of itself. There are a lot of dominant cultural negative stereotypes surrounding people and their experiences of homelessness, oftentimes very much viewed as an individual problem rather than addressing these broader structural issues that we know we have in our country, especially tied to justice involvement. So that's something where language is really key, and that's something I think we can all do is think about what types of messages that we're sending with the language that we're using, especially when talking about homelessness. So framing it as something people are experiencing rather than a key part of their identity because it is such a stigma. And thinking about young people's multiple identities as well is something that I've been looking into a lot in working with young people, primarily those who identify as LGBTQ+. So thinking about young people who identify across an array of gender and sexual diversity and expansiveness, because we do know that LGBTQ young people, those who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and or queer, among additional identities, are really overrepresented among youth experiencing homelessness. That can tie back to a lot of what Naomi was saying about experiencing family instability and rejection and conflicts surrounding their identity can oftentimes push a young person towards experiencing residential instability. So really I work to elevate young people's perspectives, especially as it ties into their multiple marginalized identities. Intersectionality is another important part of this, that young people aren't just inhabiting one singular identity, whether it's gender, sexuality, but also thinking about race and ethnicity, religion, because we do know that as these identities intersect, as they're stigmatized, it can in some cases elevate a young person's chances of experiencing homelessness. So really just focusing on humanizing young people, no matter what their experiences are, especially when they are so marginalized, and really focusing on the importance of their perspectives and just listening to young people and letting them tell their stories for themselves.
Thank you, Rachel. And in line with hearing directly from young people and having them share their stories, we have Aaron here who's going to tell us about his own experience.
Yeah, so again, my name is Aaron Toleafoa. A little bit about me is that I'm from Tacoma, Washington. So to start off, I would talk about, I grew up a little different from some of my peers, and that's because I was able to see what it was like to live in a crowded house in a bad neighborhood, and I was also able to experience what it was like to actually live in a good neighborhood. Now, though it makes sense that when I moved to a nice neighborhood, everything was better, that was actually not the case. I went from a poverty-stricken community to a community that was predominantly white. So as a child of color, I had experienced things like racism, bullying, but that I can say for another conversation. Now, when I was 13 years old, I was involved in a lot of sports. You know, I was playing football, basketball, I was playing soccer, different sports, but I was pretty good, and I got a lot of coaches to look at me for high school. So I think it was the summer before my freshman year when I had returned back to the neighborhood I had moved from. And instead of diving straight into sports and my schoolwork, I instead went down a different path. So I was arrested for multiple charges, and I've been incarcerated since I was 15 years old. Actually, I've been able to reflect back on my life since I've been locked up now. And since we're talking about poverty and homelessness, it makes sense to relate my story to those two subjects. I mentioned living in a crowded house in a bad neighborhood. At that time, I had experienced poverty and seen my grandparents, aunties, uncles, and my parents barely living off of paychecks. I remember a lot of times digging through boxes of old clothes and shoes just to see if I could find something new to wear instead of what I wore yesterday. So obviously I grew up knowing poverty, but I had a home. Now that was until after my freshman year. I'd been kicked out of the house I was living in, and I went to stay with the mother of my child. Of course, that didn't work out, and I found myself couch surfing. I don't know if anyone has been couch surfing before, but people get tired of that, and it comes to a point where your welcome is, you know, past. And so around this time, I found myself waking up to gray skies or, you know, loud cars passing by. At this point in my life, I had found that I was isolated, and I wasn't even locked up at that time. I was alone and had no funds to take care of myself. In fact, the judge who had sentenced me had said that I was actually living like an adult because I was driving cars which were stolen. I'd gotten a girl pregnant, and I was selling clothes and stolen merch to provide for myself. I was only 15-year-old during this time. And during this time, I didn't need someone to treat me like an adult. At 15 years old, I was at the age that youth need to be heard and cared for. Instead, I was treated like a super predator. And fun fact, I only learned about the whole super predator era when I got locked up, but that was the truth. I was no longer treated like a kid. I had to make choices then to grow up. And when I made that choice to become a mature young man, I found that there were things that could have prevented from my outcome from happening. And a lot of those things that I had noticed were common sense. But you know, a lot of things that go on are just made much more complicated than need be. We know that low-income communities, poverty-stricken communities produce crime. The crimes come from a lot of youth. These youth are the ones who get bad grades and attendance, and yet these are the youth who are experiencing homelessness and poverty, and on top of that, a jail cell. You know, people ask me, what can they do to make things better? And I ask those same people, what have you done already to make things better? Sometimes the answer involves a person of authority thinking that since they like something they thought of, the youth will also too. But that's not true. I think that before we think about what we would like to see personally, what do the incarcerated, poor, homeless youth need? What do they want to see for their future? That's in making things better for our system. Let's not ask the people with a PhD in whatever it is, and let's ask the real professionals what they have in mind to making our communities, whether they be behind bars or on the outside, better, safer, and more financially stable. So yeah, thank you.
Aaron, thank you so much for sharing that. I really appreciate it. And we're kind of going to continue that conversation with a talk about, the disparities that exist in the system with regard to homelessness and juvenile justice. And so, Naomi, can you weigh in on that?
Sure. And just for 1 second to back up, Aaron is an amazing young leader, and he didn't toot his horn, so I'm going to share some stuff for him. He has helped change laws from inside a facility in Washington State. He's helped shape and lead our organization. He serves on our executive board and is leading at a national level. So when he says that folks who are youth have leadership potential, he is that leadership potential. And just really, without him, this work doesn't, I can't talk after him, right? Because he just said everything that needs to be said in a way that it needs to be said. So thank you, Aaron. In terms of disparities, I think that everyone who works in this work knows that there are vast ethnic and racial disparities across the juvenile justice system at nearly every point of contact in the justice system in nearly every major city across the country. We see that kids of color are overrepresented at the point of arrest, at detention, less representation at the point of diversion, and being given alternatives to incarceration. That's a problem that has persisted for decades in our system, and as the number of youth who are incarcerated has decreased from their highs in the 90s to their current lower levels, those racial and ethnic disparities have increased and been exacerbated. There is a lot of great work going on around the country to try to address and end those disparities, but they continue to be pervasive in our justice system, and they continue to be pervasive among youth experiencing homelessness as well. The US ICH, their research shows that about 83% increased likelihood of experiencing homelessness for folks who are African American as compared to their white peers. And those numbers hold true also. Similar rates of disparity are seen for school push-out numbers from the Office of Civil Rights data, and also for incarceration and court involvement numbers. And I saw a question come up a moment ago from Alicia about research on the correlation between foster youth and incarceration and homelessness. And we see similar rates of disparities, again, among foster youth, right? And in some ways that shouldn't surprise us, because often we're shuffling the same kids from one system to the next system to the next system without addressing the underlying problems. So those disparities are quite pervasive, and I'll let Rachel talk a little bit about LGBTQ plus youth and disparities there.
Thank you, Naomi, and thank you, Aaron, so much for sharing your perspective as well. And yeah, so thinking about additional disparities that do intersect with those across social class, race, and ethnicity as well, we really have to think about young people's multiple identities. So across how they distinctively identify within their gender as well as sexuality is really critical for creating these more inclusive, equitable resources and opportunities, because continuing in this country, just like we have in the Supreme Court right now, questions on whether we can legally discriminate against people based on their gender and sexual identity, especially in the realm of employment. And this is going to have really cascading effects when we think about those who endure very distinctive marginalization, people who are young, youth of color who also identify as LGBTQ. These are really layered levels of marginalization that young people have to endure. And so in thinking about these disparities, we really have to be attuned to exactly what Aaron was saying, and thinking about serving as conduits for young people's voices, because they have so many strengths and so much potential that we could be drawing from and adding to this discourse and narrative and conversation. And so I think enhancing those opportunities for young people, making those opportunities available, and really elevating their particular identities to really challenge that stigma that continues to impact them on both the very personal level, the interpersonal, and these very structural realms that young people are struggling with. And when they don't have a lot of those resources to draw from, it is our responsibility to work towards really elevating those to that level where they can get those resources that they need from their own perspective, rather than assuming what they need or thinking that the professionals know best. The young people are living these things every day. And so I think it just speaks to that element of really acknowledging young people's diversity and drawing from that and viewing it as a strength rather than as a detriment.
Thank you, Rachel. And is there anything else you wanted to discuss with regard to the research that you're doing?
Yeah, so with thinking about the work that I've done, it spanned a lot of different components of thinking about young people's lives growing up, how their LGBTQ identities impact their experiences, which is where more of my work is going, especially in terms of health. And what I find is that young people, they're really doing a lot of that labor themselves to meet their needs. And what I've been doing most recently is working with young people on what they would like to see in terms of services, especially to enhance their mental health, because that's another area of disparities that we see for young people in general, is that the more structural marginalization that they're experiencing across their identities, the more that they have to enact that labor to manage all of that stigma that they're enduring. And one component of that is companion animals or pet relationships, especially among youth experiencing homelessness, because some emerging work shows that a lot of young people, even when they're managing residential instability, they really work hard to maintain their pet relationships. There's oftentimes a stigma and a misconception that people experiencing homelessness don't have the resources, or if they're not able, to take care of themselves, how can they take care of an animal? But the research really debunks that myth and shows that young people are committed to their pets and taking care of them, oftentimes without that structural support that we see for other, how people living in homes or having stable houses who have pets. And in terms of mental health, I think this is a great opportunity that as researchers, as providers, again, we can listen to youth voices and work to really make more pet inclusive housing for young people, especially those who identify as LGBTQ. Oftentimes they experience a lot of judgment from people when it comes to their identity. And so pets can be one resource that really supports their mental health without judgment, without fear of stigma. So I think, again, listening to young people on what they need and what they would really benefit from is really critical. And that's where I've been looking at with thinking about companion animals, especially as being that more untapped resource that we could be drawing from, whether it's pet inclusive resources or pet therapy programming for young people experiencing homelessness. Just a couple options that I'm looking at with some of this more exploratory research.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And now as we kind of transition to the more legal context of youth homelessness, Judge Teske, can you talk about how homelessness plays out over the life of a criminal case for young people?
Sure. Well, I'll start off by saying it's not very good, quite frankly. And that is a systemic issue by the nature of way many systems operate. I want to begin by using Aaron as an example with what he said, by noting that in listening to Aaron, we see what a strong voice he has. And we see, we can learn a great deal, as Rachel was saying, about what homeless youth are going through, what got them there, which leads us to understanding how to help them help themselves. But what's happened in our system and how it plays out is that, quite frankly, we criminalize homeless youth. When they find themselves in contact with the juvenile justice system, we first go to detention. We don't know where to put them. And many systems find themselves in that situation because the court system is not engaging the social service system and other parts of the system in a what I call a professionally aggressive way to bring them in as a resource, okay? So that we judges are not looking at detention, all right, as that default measure. Why is that important? Well, the research is adamant, okay, that detention is harmful, all right? It subjects youth to abuse, sexual, physical abuse. It stunts their emotional you know, their emotional growth. It impedes their educational growth. It exacerbates their already existing issues. And so that's particularly important for homeless youth, because they're homeless for reasons for which they're running away from something that's not good, in their home, on the streets, poverty, whatever it may be. And then we're going to go ahead and put them in jail, for God's sakes. Okay. You know, we need to understand what are the underlying causes. You know, and I know Naomi has heard me teach this before, but we need to look at this from a public health approach, okay? You know, and that is taking the epidemiology model. You know, just like diseases, they don't occur by chance. They're not randomly distributed, okay? Now, homelessness is not a disease, but it behaves the same way. Homelessness does not occur by chance. Homelessness, you know, is not randomly distributed, you know, which means we can come up with treatment modalities, okay, that are effective, and even down at the individual level. This also means that we need to reconfigure our system, okay, so that we don't make youth worse, okay, all right? And when we take homeless youth and we put them in detention thinking, well, we're going to cure this homelessness, we're going to keep them safe and secure. In fact, we're not doing that, okay? So, you know, I want to come back full circle to Aaron, all right? And listening to his powerful story that if judges just listen, if the system just listens to our youth like Aaron, it will help us to take a better look and be more introspective of how we're doing business. And that detention, okay, is not the way to go, but that we as, and I'm talking about judges, if there's any person, stakeholder that has the ability to engage the other parts of the system to do their part, you know, we could do it. Now I'm going to stop there because I'm going to be talking in a moment, right, with Naomi. And there are some concrete ways. I have some concrete, very specific tools, okay, that I would recommend. I'm just now talking about how it plays out, which generally is not good, but we can change it around. I'll talk about it in a moment.
Thank you, Judge Teske. And so right now we're going into that conversation. So you and Naomi can, you know, discuss, you know, whether or not there are legal mechanisms in place to take into account the role of youth homelessness, what should be the case, and in those specific steps you mentioned.
Well, Naomi, do you want to go first?
Sure, although I would typically defer to you as the judge. So I will get started and then feel free to jump in whenever you want. Okay. So part of our project at CJJ around youth homelessness has been looking exactly at this. What can folks do to end this link and intersection between juvenile justice and youth homelessness? Big part of that work has been our principles for change, which are recommendations for policymakers, advocates, judges, attorneys, all of those folks, very individualized, what they, as individual stakeholders, can do in this effort. One of the things that I think stands out just first and foremost is asking questions and listening to people, right? What the charge that comes before you isn't always the main issue that's going on in somebody's life, and getting to know that young person, getting to hear what brought them before you in court, right? And that goes for us as attorneys as well. I remember when I was still practicing, there was a young man here in the District of Columbia who I got the chance to meet, and listening to him and listening to his experience and his stories, and understanding that his life experience was different than mine was very eye-opening for me and changing in terms of his case. I think one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that folks come before the court experiencing homelessness for a variety of reasons, right? We talked about status offenses a moment ago, those things like running away from home, skipping school, but there can also be survival crimes, trespassing, right? Because you need some place to go when it's too hot or too cold. Survival crimes like survival sex, for example, stealing food, for example, all of those things that people need as necessities to survive in life. and keeping in mind that by asking questions, we can get down to the meat of the issues. One other thing that I would highlight before deferring back to the judge, the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, which was just reauthorized, includes some really good language. States in their state plan are going to be asked to address how they're taking reentry planning into account, including housing of a young person, education, employment, all of those pieces. So that's going to be fleshed out and more concrete moving forward than it has been in many states. And then also just thinking creatively, right? Connecticut, for example, has a mobile legal van that they use. Instead of making young people come to the attorneys and find them, they take the van to places where they know that young people who lack stable housing often congregate. So parks, things like that, they'll put it on social media in advance and then take their legal unit out to the field.
So picking up from there, some specific mechanisms. First of all, my suggestion would be in a juvenile justice system, misdemeanor cases have no business going into the courtroom. I do not allow misdemeanor cases to come into the courtroom. The only way they get into the courtroom is, number one, the youth is exercising their Sixth Amendment right to a trial. Okay, and even when that's the case, if they happen to be adjudicated on it, it still goes back. It doesn't. I don't allow plea bargaining in my court. Okay, I'm sorry, but the district attorney and the defense have no clue as to what is the appropriate disposition on a kid in order to get that kid to admit. And I think those things are very important because already that precludes homeless youth getting caught going deeper into the system. So at your intake, one of the questions on our questionnaire is asking, the intake officer is asking, is this a homeless youth? Okay. If the answer is yes, we have a protocol with our social services where they have up to 6 hours to identify a placement. This kid is not going to go into detention. The only way this kid is going to go into detention if this kid truly is a public safety case. In other words, this kid presents a risk of serious injury to other people. And those are few, very, very few cases, okay? And that's the case because our average daily detention population used to be 62 in a 60-bed facility, and now it's only 10.9. So then the next step is creating a multidisciplinary panel. We have what's called the Clayton County Collaborative Child Study Team, who then immediately, okay, evaluates, okay, the child's or the youth situation, okay, trying to identify, all the why, what, when, where, how around, this youth being homeless, and then moving toward that treatment modality to address. So we have social services there, we have mental health, we have a whole bunch of service providers there. They're all sitting around the table. The youth is made available, okay, and so we begin that process. The point I'm trying to make, okay, is that, we don't need to have homeless youth going any deeper into the juvenile justice system. A juvenile justice system needs to create a wall and a separate system that is safe, that is friendly, and that is solution oriented.
I found this on the web.
Ooh. Okay, Naomi. Comment on that.
I think that just to piggyback off of that and to build on that, again, asking those questions, those deep probing questions is so important, and making sure that young people don't have to be shuffled further into the justice system, right? The data shows that the further someone goes into the justice system, the more likely they are to have future contact with the justice system. So if we can connect people with services on the front end, the better off we're going to be in the long run. And then I think also advocacy and policymakers play a huge role in this in terms of making sure that young people aren't criminalized for experiencing homelessness in the first place. I talked earlier about the curfew laws that we have in a lot of jurisdictions, for example. They're meant to keep folks safe, but if you don't have a place to go when the clock strikes 10 or 11 o'clock at night, whatever your curfew might be in your city, you're automatically criminalized for that experience. There's little alternative, right? So making sure that you have alternative options for housing for young people, and that your policies aren't directly or indirectly criminalizing young people. Law enforcement also play a huge role in this. We talk a lot about making sure that there are alternatives to taking someone to a detention facility, for example, right? That there are Runaway and Homeless Youth Act providers in your community, that you're using those Runaway and Homeless Youth Act providers as an alternative to taking someone to law enforcement or taking someone to a detention facility or the police depot. Because often once you have papers on that case, that's gonna taint the way you're seen the next time you come before law enforcement. So making sure that, when you're dismissed from something, that it is no paper, 100% no paper. Judge, I'm gonna kick it back over to you to see if you have anything to add on any of that.
Yeah, thank you, Naomi. Very good points. I would add this too, in terms of the role of judges, okay, as well as attorneys, even service providers. I would highly recommend looking into the concept, and I'm speaking, and actually this can apply to everybody, but I'm speaking mostly to the judges, what is called procedural fairness. When we do have our homeless youth that we may have that's in a dependency, let's say, is in a dependent situation, we have a dependent case, or it may be one that initially came to me as a delinquent case, but because of the front loading, it never got into me as a delinquent case, but then it switches over into a dependency case. So it's now coming to me. Is procedural fairness is about building relationships, and that judges need to build a positive relationship with with the homeless youth, okay, that they have. Now, how do you do that? First of all, it's just the way you talk, okay? Always be kind, always be respectful, be complimentary. But to do that, you need to do it often. Well, how does a judge do that often? Well, use the review hearings. I have a policy that I see all my homeless youth at least every 3 months, some even more often depending upon their circumstances, all right? And the treatment team is going to be present in the courtroom. We'll be making reports and letting that youth talk, okay, and speak to me. How are things going? How am I going to know how that youth is being treated, okay, if I don't give that youth an opportunity in a safe place to speak to the judge? And, surveying all the kids, every time I ask them, do you still want to come back? And, every one of them says, yeah, Judge, I want to talk to you. I like coming here, okay, And what that does, it helps to increase their emotional stability, is what the treatment team is saying. And so I have little things on my bench that remind me to be respectful, to smile, and things of that nature, okay? And I put up in the courtroom on my bench, I have these pictures, okay, that are really friendly and so forth. Again, we're juvenile court judges, for God's sakes, okay? We're not adult court judges, all right? We need to be responsive to youth and help them feel safe and free to be able, to share. So with lawyers in that, they need to advocate. They need to, those kids need to hear those lawyers say what that kid wants to say, okay? And that's very important. And we need to create that support system around them. And that means as procedural fairness, we all need to be that way, okay? Respectful, kind, and most important of all, what Rachel was saying, and really what Aaron was saying, listen, 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 all right? Learn to shut up and listen. I'm done.
Thank you so much, Naomi and Judge Teske. And so now we just want to hear from the panelists about more details about the work that they're doing, and then how volunteers could potentially engage with them. And so, Dr. Schimtz, if you can start us off, that'd be great.
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. And thank you all for sharing your perspectives. I'm learning so much and I really appreciate it. So the work that I've been doing here in Oklahoma, I'm finding just incredibly invigorating and inspiring, working with organizations operating primarily out of Oklahoma City and Tulsa, but just learning about the work they're doing. I think that's a great opportunity that anybody can learn about in their own community, is just getting engaged with the people doing the groundwork, getting engaged with people experiencing homelessness. Again, viewing them as fellow human beings and listening to their experiences. You can learn so much. So for example, Oklahoma City just recently, in the past 5 years, I believe, have created what they call the Homeless Alliance. And so they've been working to connect the multiple different service providers that people experiencing homelessness could be involved in, to have more of this centralized database that they can all be working just more collaboratively to meet people's diverse needs of what those might look like. In Tulsa, I've been engaged with Youth Services Tulsa, and they're really amazing about providing really inclusive programming, especially across young people's expansive gender and sexual identities, just to ensure that they know that it's a very welcoming and safe place, that they can be who they are, when that might be the first time that they've experienced that. A lot of the young people that I interviewed coming out of Tulsa, engaged with Youth Services Tulsa, shared exactly that just the power of somebody listening, validating, and just affirming their experience and their identities can be so powerful in impacting their mental health in a positive way, their self-esteem, just their outlook on life. So I think the power of language and then the power of spreading that message of kindness and compassion can be so much more powerful than we might have imagined, especially for young people who may feel that they have nowhere else to go. So opportunities for engagement. I think, especially speaking to the students out there, depending on the work that you're interested in, if it does overlap anything with my work and working with LGBTQ identified young people experiencing homelessness, I'm happy to serve as a mentor if you have questions about getting your own work off the ground, or maybe fleshing out what you would want to focus on, or what that research might look like in your methodology. I'm happy to talk through that. So feel free to reach out if you're a student and you're working on maybe your own project, whatever that might be. If it overlaps in any way, I'm happy to talk more with you and support you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And then Erin, I know Naomi kind of touched on some of the amazing work that you're doing, but if you could share more about that and the change you've been able to create, that'd be great.
Yeah, so here in Washington State, for the facility that I'm in, we actually do a lot of work with legislators and lobbyists to kind of just talk with them and try to push for what we want to see in this system actually change through the legislation sessions. So part of what we're trying to work on for next year that we're already getting prepared for is actually homelessness, and then also poverty too. So for our homeless, we are actually working on defining what homelessness is. So a lot of times, people think that homelessness is just, you just literally have no home. But sometimes it's not just not having a place to stay. It's also, are you couch surfing? Are you, going from here to here? Do you have a stable home? Do you have a consistent place to rest your head at night, every night? And so we're working on defining homelessness. And then for like poverty, a lot of kids that come out from this facility here, they're going back to the same communities that they came from. And then on top of that, they have a debt, they have restitution that they have to pay. So for me, I have $290,000 for my restitution. I don't know, I personally don't know any 15-year-old who has that amount of money when he gets out to pay off that debt. And so, that's what we're working on here in Washington State, is getting rid of all these debts that people have to pay, and this ridiculous amount of money that people are being charged to even get an education. That's what we're working on for homelessness. Like a lot of kids here, what they try not to do is let kids be released into homelessness. We try to make our reentry plan as solid as possible, making sure that before a kid gets out, he has a place to stay, defining a home. is home where your family is? You know, is that a distant memory now that you're, you know, finally being released? So now we have to really think about these things that you know, the youth are actually going to experience when they get out. Some kids, you know, come in here at 14 years old and they get out when they're, you know, 18 years old. Now they have to make adult decisions. Now they have to go into getting a job, in, you know, applying for a job, and, you know, having to take care of themselves. When before they were, you know, locked up, they had to do similar things like that, but now it's the real world. Now you have to do these things as an adult. And so that's what we're doing here in Washington. I think a lot of those solutions, like I said, a lot of it is common sense. It's easy, but it's just a process that we have to go around to make these things happen.
Aaron, that is amazing work, and I'm excited to see, you know, what more you continue to do. So thank you for that. Naomi, do you want to talk about what Coalition for Juvenile Justice is doing?
Sure. So in addition to creating the resources that I mentioned earlier with the Principles for Change and the sort of toolkits for individual professionals and their roles in addressing the intersections between youth homelessness and juvenile justice, we're now engaging in training and technical assistance in communities across the country to try to help them implement those recommendations and hopefully end the link that currently exists, right? Like we talked about a moment ago, where we're shuffling kids from one system to another, breaking down those silos of communication and making sure that folks who are working on homelessness systems and folks who are working on juvenile justice systems and foster care systems are all coming together to the table together. And I think that's something that the volunteers and students who are online here today can help with in their own communities as well, right? Making sure, if you're an attorney, that you're working with other folks across systems and that you're looking at the young people who are in your courtroom the same way that you would your own kids, right? That you're advocating for your kids as whole kids and not just one piece or one system. One of the other things that folks could do, CJJ is a membership organization. We represent state advisory groups across the country. Those are governor-appointed bodies in each state and territory. And there are opportunities for folks who are interested in juvenile justice improvement to serve on those boards and panels. I'm happy to connect you with your local state agency if you want to get involved in that way. And it's definitely an opportunity for folks in a variety of professions, and then also for young people as well. There's a set proportion of youth who are required to be on each state advisory group. So it's a great opportunity for youth to start exercising their own voice and sharing in that leadership opportunity, because as we talked about earlier, there is no better way to help improve a system than to listen to young people. Similarly, if you're a young person, our Emerging Leaders Committee, which Aaron chairs, is going to be accepting applications for next year's cohort soon. So that's another great way to get involved. If you know young people, you know, who you think might be interested, we would love to have them apply. We, you know, open the opportunity to folks who are previously involved, currently involved, or just interested in juvenile justice system improvement. So those are just a few ways that you could get engaged.
Thank you, Naomi. And finally, just Teske, do you want to add?
Well, I really don't have much more to add, because I shared, you know, a lot about my own system and how we've changed it, okay, to be friendly to our youth, and specifically to homeless youth. And you know, the goal is that homeless youth do not even step foot into the juvenile justice system. They may have been brought to our courthouse steps by a police officer, but we don't allow them to enter the door, but we instead allow them to enter into a different pathway that is about seeking answers and solutions that is going to help them. And, you know, I have enjoyed now, because of this change in the system, a higher rate of homeless youth who are signing themselves back into care at age 18, as opposed to going out there on their own, which we know from the statistics, when they do that, they end up going back into a spiral, you know, downward turn. And again, I attributed that to a system that doesn't treat them as criminals, doesn't criminalize them. It should not be a crime to be poor, okay? Or to have had bad things happen to you and to be traumatized, okay? Only to be engaged by a system that re-traumatizes you. You know, and I also, though, want to say this and piggyback what Aaron is saying. You know, the whole things about restitution and fines. I'm appalled, quite frankly, that we have a system, and I think a lot of it has to do with our economic perspective on things. Okay, and that's fine. Okay, you know, but we have to be careful to what extent that we apply our economic perspectives, particularly in capitalism. Okay, and I enjoy myself as a capitalist. Okay, but you know, we need to be more prudent. You know, I mean, he's right. Telling a 15-year-old you have $200 and some thousand to pay in restitution, give me a break, okay? You know, and how about fines? I mean, we're hitting fines, probation fee fines, attorney fee fines, all these different fines, okay? And you know, well, you know, whatever happened, you know, to understanding excessive fines, and that's in the Constitution, okay? And one's ability to pay, especially when it comes, you know, to our youth. So, you know, I would just simply say, and I will tell you this, I have to give credit to my former governor, Governor Deal, who recognized what we did in Clayton County. And back in 2012, appointed me to the criminal justice reform. So many of these things I've just shared with you are now in our law, speaking of policy, you know, accepted by our General Assembly, where our detention rates are down quite a bit. Our commitment rates are down. I mean, in my own county, the number of kids committed to state custody is down 90%, okay? You know, so, you know, but yet the crime rates aren't going up. My delinquency filings are down 82%. I mean, delinquency filings, that's juvenile crime, is down 82%. Felonies down 64%. It's all because we're just a nicer system. We're nicer to kids because we treat them like youth, okay, instead of beating them up.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of our panelists for sharing their stories and the work that they're doing. And so right now we're going to have Molly talk to you all about the work that the Justice Volunteers do and how you can be engaged. And then after that, we'll go into questions and answers.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kelly. And thank you to all of our panelists, Judge Teske, Aaron, Naomi, and Rachel. We're so grateful for the time that you're sharing with us today and sharing your expertise. So thank you again for being here. I want to take up too much time, just very quickly want to talk a little bit about Justice Volunteers and the role that we hope to play and these and other issues in the criminal justice system. I wanted to thank the panelists in particular for this last portion, talking about the work that you're doing already to really advance reform forward on this topic, and emphasize that Justice Volunteers, one of the main things we try to do is just echo and shed light on the work that's already happening, and connect volunteers across the country like you to what's already happening in your communities. So this month, October, is Youth Justice Awareness and Action Month, being led by organizations on the ground across the country as well. So this is just the first of 2 webinars that we're going to be doing this month on the issue. Our next one, next Thursday, is about the criminalization of youth behavior, particularly in communities of color, another really important issue. And so in the meantime, we're doing a lot across 3 sort of main teams that we have in Justice Volunteers to try to continue that work on juvenile justice issues in particular this month. We've had, as Kelly mentioned, some of you already signed up as YJAM, the Youth Justice Action Awareness Month ambassadors, meaning that we're just asking you not only to share additional articles on your social media about these issues, participate in some specific research projects that are related to some of these issues, and then also taking action in your communities. But we're also asking volunteers, and as all of our panelists and Judge Teske in particular emphasized, to listen also to what's going on and then share that information with us so that we can elevate and shed light on those things also. So at Justice Volunteers, we, this month and then moving forward, have these 3 teams: media amplification, research, and action, try to combine a lot of the things, work that's really important to move the needle on this and other issues in the criminal justice system. We also use something called Slack as the backbone of our communication with volunteers so that we can connect people across the country. We're going to have a poll come up just very quickly, asking you if you'd like to participate with us this month on some specific juvenile justice issues. And then if you're interested in any of the teams that I mentioned. And finally, if you're interested in joining Slack, the tool that we use online to connect and share information about all these things. Just want to thank you all for being here, again, as volunteers, to listen and hear this information, and then hope that you will share it also with your communities so we can, as our panelists have done today, break through what I think can be often a really obscure part of the criminal justice system and try and not only share information about what's happening, but how we can improve those things. I know we already have some really great questions, so I want to turn it back over to you, Kelly, to get that started.
Thanks, Molly. And so our first question is from Julie Bernstein, and she asks, what can be done to identify at-risk youth with fragile home situations before they become homeless? And so this is open to any of you who want to chime in.
Yeah, so to answer that, for me personally, I think as a kid who actually experienced some of that, I think for the school districts, they can definitely look at their grades, look at their attendance. I think I mentioned that before. And pretty much you can, you know, even for counseling, I know I had counselors at my school, but for me, it was kind of really fast when it happened. And that's probably one thing that I would say is that when working with these kids, you can see that their grades are low, their attendance is low, and so something is going on. If they're acting out in class, obviously something's going on, maybe at home. So I would say that's probably a way to identify those youth.
I would just echo that. I think that schools are such a vital ally in this work, both in terms of identifying folks who might be experiencing homelessness or potentially about to experience homelessness, and then also in terms of connecting folks with services. Right, there has been a lot of research done in communities across the country about the number of youth who are experiencing homelessness in those communities and in those schools specifically. A lot of schools have resource officers who work specifically with youth who are experiencing homelessness. So making those resources better known and connecting folks sooner in the process.
Thank you. And it looks like we're running a little short on time, so this might be our last question, but what alternative programs have been found to be most effective alternatives to detention? And I would say even to prosecution in general, for young people and particularly homeless young people.
So there's been an array of alternatives. The Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative from the Annie Casey Foundation has done fantastic work to keep kids out of the system and keep kids from getting deeper into the system. There's also been a lot of great initiatives. Illinois, for example, has done some work around truancy and making sure that young people who are missing school are connected with services. And what they do there is bring together a panel of the young people, family members, educators, counselors, everybody comes to the table together and really talk through what's going on, because it could be something as simple as, I don't have an alarm clock, right? And we're criminalizing someone because they're not going to school, when it could be a simple fix. Judge Teske's work in Clayton County has been amazing as well in terms of reducing the number of kids who come into contact with the courts at all.
Aaron and Judge Teske, do you want to weigh in before we wrap up?
Well, first of all, Naomi, thank you for that compliment. I know one of the things that I've done that's been replicated in 41 states is that school justice partnership, and within that school justice partnership, well, the mainstay of it is to reduce the number of kids being referred from the schools over to the juvenile court. And we can see within that that some of these kids who are being referred to us are kids who have been traumatized, of which some of those are kids who really are homeless youth, okay? And we've had over the years, since we've implemented the school justice partnership, and I'm talking about since 2003, is incorporating, okay, in the engagement of when we are handling, when students, let's say are disruptive, is to engage them and to identify whether or not they're homeless. And so that we can then begin to work, as I described earlier, using that kind of epidemiology approach, that, to identify what would be the appropriate, treatment modality. So I would recommend that we do focus on schools.
Yeah, Kelly, I would just agree with Naomi and Judge Teske. I think they hit it right on the head.
Perfect, thank you. And so that's all the time we have for questions, but please keep them coming, and you can email them to volunteer@thejusticecollaborative.com, and then we'll pass those along. And as you should see on your screen, there is a survey that just popped up, and we would love to get your feedback about how this webinar went and what issues you would like us to focus on. And because this is Youth Justice Action Month, we will be having another webinar, as Molly mentioned, and that will be next Thursday. And so you'll get an email about that as well. And so thank you again, Naomi, Aaron, Judge Teske, and Dr. Schimtz, and thank you all for tuning in. Enjoy the rest of your day.